The court laughed at a homeless black veteran until he said his name. What if the man society calls a criminal was once the hero who carried others through fire? In a cold courtroom, an old black Marine stands accused of trespassing. No one knows his name yet. No one remembers his sacrifice. But when the judge asks for his name, everything changes. Elias Carter, Staff Sergeant, United States Marines. And in that moment, the room freezes. Because the man they're ready to punish once saved the judge's own brother in a war zone. What happens next will leave an entire courtroom standing in awe, and will leave you questioning how many heroes our world has forgotten. From hero to homeless, the forgotten name of Elias Carter. The courtroom felt cold that morning, not because of the air conditioning, but because of something deeper, a chill born from indifference. Rows of people sat quietly, their faces blank, eyes fixed on their phones as though nothing in that room could possibly matter. Then the door creaked open, and an elderly black man shuffled in, his wrists cuffed in front of him, his steps slow and deliberate. The sound of chains clinking against metal echoed off the sterile walls. His coat, a faded military green, was 2 sizes too big and frayed along the seams. It hung on him like a heavy memory he could never shed. "State your name," the clerk said, not looking up from her papers. The man's voice cracked, weak yet carrying an unspoken weight. "Elias Carter, Staff Sergeant, United States Marines." For a brief second, the words hung in the air, unanswered. A few heads lifted. Most went back to scrolling, unaware that history had just walked into the room wearing scuffed boots and hand-me-down clothes. At the bench, Judge Olivia Parker barely raised her eyes as she flipped through his file. City of Newbridge versus Elias Carter. Charges: disturbing the peace, trespassing, resisting arrest. Routine, she thought. Just another homeless man caught between the cracks of a society that had no place for the discarded. Her pen hovered, ready to sign off on the prosecutor's recommendation: 30 days of community service and a no-trespass order for downtown. But then she saw it, that name. Elias Carter, her breath caught, her fingers stilled. It couldn't be him, not the same man. She forced her eyes back to the thin, frail figure sitting hunched at the defense table. Could this be the Marine who had once carried her brother out of the fiery chaos of Fallujah? Could this broken man, wearing shoes held together with duct tape, really be the hero she had searched for all those years ago? Case 47B, the bailiff called. City of Newbridge versus Elias Carter. Elias rose slowly, his knees cracking audibly in the silent room. Each movement seemed to cost him something, as though time had weighed down every joint and memory had anchored his shoulders. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from years of untreated injuries. Vietnam first, then Iraq. Wounds visible and wounds buried deep beneath skin and bone, carried with silent dignity across decades. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, a young man with a polished suit and rehearsed tone. "Mr. Carter has been warned several times about loitering behind Jefferson Street Cafe. The owner has filed 3 separate complaints this month. He has shown a pattern of ignoring lawful orders." Elias stood there silent. He didn't flinch, didn't argue. He was used to this, being spoken about, not spoken to. The prosecutor continued. "We recommend 30 days of community service and a no-trespass order for the downtown area." Olivia Parker lifted her gaze, her sharp eyes scanning Elias. His coat swallowed his thin frame. His dark, weathered face seemed older than his years. The deep lines spoke of hardship, loss, and the quiet pain of a man long forgotten. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady, "do you have legal representation today?" Elias shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am, my public defender, he got pulled into another courtroom." "Would you like to speak on your own behalf?" He cleared his throat. The sound was rough, like gravel scraping against metal. "No excuses, ma'am. I just needed a warm place to sit, wasn't looking for trouble." "Why that location?" She pressed, her tone firm but laced with curiosity. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes lowering to the floor. "Jimmy, the cook there, he leaves food sometimes. I've known him since he was a boy. His daddy served with me. Desert Storm." A flicker of recognition passed over her face. She adjusted her glasses and leaned forward slightly. "And your service, Mr. Carter?" "United States Marine Corps, 1975 to 1995. Staff Sergeant, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, Iraq." The words landed heavily in the room, shifting the air. It was the kind of silence that comes when people realize they've been in the presence of someone they didn't truly see. In the back row, an older man in a Marine League jacket straightened his posture, his eyes fixed on Elias. The prosecutor paused, visibly uneasy, but quickly recovered. Your Honor, while Mr. Carter's military service is commendable, it doesn't excuse repeated violations of the law. The business owners have a right to operate without interference or unauthorized presence on their property. Judge Parker's fingers tapped lightly against her bench. She didn't answer right away. Her thoughts had already drifted to another time, another place. An image of her younger brother Jack, smiling in his Marine dress uniform, standing proudly on the day of his commissioning. And then the letters. She remembered every word of those letters he had sent home from Fallujah. Staff Sergeant Carter. If not for him, I wouldn't be here to write this letter. 2 weeks later, her brother's convoy hit an IED, the folded flag, the soundless sobs of her parents, and the Marine who had approached them at the funeral with tears in his own eyes. Your brother saved my life, he had said, but he'd want you to know Carter saved us all. She had tried to find him once long ago. Mason Quinn, they had told her then, discharged with PTSD, lost in the system. But now he was standing before her again. Only this time, no medals adorned his chest. No crisp uniform, just a man left behind by the country he had once sworn to protect. Mr. Carter, she said finally, her voice softer now, please remain seated. The court will take a short recess. Elias lowered himself back into his chair, his joints stiff, his eyes downcast. He had no idea why the judge was staring at him like that. He only knew he was tired. Tired of cold nights, of empty stares, of being invisible in a world he had once risked everything to defend. And somewhere in that still, quiet courtroom, history was holding its breath. The soldier from yesterday, a name that carried history. The silence in the courtroom pressed down like a heavy weight. Elias Carter's voice had cracked when he spoke, yet his words carried an unexpected authority that seemed to cut through the sterile air. United States Marine Corps, 1975 to 95, Staff Sergeant, Fallujah, Iraq. For a moment, no one moved. Even the young prosecutor, so eager minutes earlier, faltered slightly, his rehearsed confidence slipping as the name of Fallujah settled over the room like a specter from a war most Americans preferred to forget. Judge Olivia Parker sat frozen, her pen still hovering above the case file. Her eyes locked on the man before her, this frail, dark-skinned veteran whose hands trembled slightly as he clutched the edge of the table. The courtroom lights reflected off his worn face, showing the deep creases time had carved into his skin, creases that weren't just age, but the weight of memories no civilian would ever carry. She asked softly, her tone shifting. Mr. Carter, what brought you to that location? Elias hesitated. His voice came out rough and tired, but there was no bitterness, only a weary humility. Didn't have nowhere else to go, ma'am. I was just trying to keep warm. Jimmy, the cook at the cafe, sometimes he leaves food near the vent. I've known him since he was a boy. His daddy served with me back in Desert Storm. Olivia Parker's lips parted slightly. A flicker of something crossed her face. Recognition, or was it disbelief? She leaned back in her chair, gripping her glasses tighter. The prosecutor broke the pause with a sharp tone, attempting to regain control. Your Honor, with all due respect, his military service isn't the issue here. This is about repeated violations of city ordinances. The law must be applied equally. But Olivia barely heard him. Her gaze was fixed on Elias Carter. The name wouldn't leave her mind. It felt heavy with familiarity, like an echo from a past she'd tried to bury. Her voice was low when she spoke again. This court will recess for 5 minutes. The bailiff looked surprised but nodded. All rise. As the room stirred with shuffling feet and whispered conversations, Olivia stepped briskly into her chambers, closing the door behind her. The sound of the latch locking seemed louder than it should have been. Inside, she moved to her desk and opened the bottom drawer. From it, she pulled out a weathered photograph, its edges frayed from years of being held and studied. In the picture, a younger Olivia stood beside her brother, Lieutenant Jack Parker, on the day of his commissioning. He wore his Marine dress uniform, his grin wide and proud, his arm draped protectively over her shoulders. They had both been so young then, so sure of the future. Beside the photograph was an old letter, the ink faded but still legible. She unfolded it carefully, her hands trembling slightly. Jack's words stared back at her, written during his deployment in Iraq. We got caught in an ambush outside Fallujah. I thought I wouldn't make it out live. But then came Staff Sergeant Carter. He ran through gunfire like he didn't care about the bullets, dragged me to safety. If not for him, I wouldn't be writing this letter. He's the kind of Marine I hope I can be someday. Olivia closed her eyes. The memory of Jack's funeral rose in her mind unbidden, the folded flag pressed into her mother's shaking hands, the haunting sound of taps, the Marine who had approached their family afterward. "Your brother saved my life," he'd said softly. "But if you ever hear the name Carter, know that he saved us all that day." She had spent years trying to find that man, desperate to learn more about the last moments of her brother's life. But Carter had vanished, discharged with severe PTSD, lost somewhere in the labyrinth of a system that promised care but delivered indifference. And now, 2 decades later, he was sitting in her courtroom, invisible to everyone but her. Her fingers brushed the edge of the photo as her eyes glistened. How does a man like that, a man who once carried my brother through hell, end up here? There was a soft knock on the door. "Judge Parker," the bailiff called from outside. "We're ready when you are." Olivia took a deep breath, folding the letter carefully and setting it beside the photo. She placed her glasses back on, though the weight of memory still pressed against her chest. When she stood, her shoulders squared and her expression hardened, not from coldness, but from the resolve that had carried her through years on the bench. She whispered under her breath before stepping back into the courtroom. "Not this time. He won't be forgotten again." The mysterious defender, a lawyer, steps into the fire. The creak of the heavy courtroom doors broke the stillness like a sudden gust of wind sweeping through dry leaves. Heads turned as a man strode in with quiet authority, his tailored navy suit perfectly pressed, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. He carried no briefcase but held a leather portfolio under one arm, as if every move had been planned and measured. "Your Honor!" His voice was smooth, deep, commanding enough to silence even the murmurs in the gallery. "Alexander Ross. I've just been retained to represent Mr. Carter." Judge Parker arched an eyebrow. "Mr. Ross, this is highly irregular. The court was not informed of any change in representation." "I understand, Your Honor," Ross replied calmly. "It was a last-minute development, but I respectfully request a brief recess to confer with my client." Elias turned slowly toward the man, confusion etched across his weathered face. I didn't call no lawyer," he said softly, his voice cracking. "I ain't got no money for this." Ross crouched slightly, bringing himself to Elias' level so his words were for him alone. "You won't need it. My firm is taking this on pro bono." Elias shook his head, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Why, you don't even know me." "I don't," Ross admitted, his voice lowering, "but I know enough. And someone needs to stand up for you before this system swallows you whole." Judge Parker's gavel struck once. "Very well, this court is in recess for 15 minutes. She rose briskly, stepping into her chambers. Ross helped Elias lower himself back into the chair. "Don't worry, let me handle this. You've carried enough weight already." Elias stared at the floor, his lips pressing together tightly as if holding back words that had been buried for decades. Inside her chambers, Olivia Parker removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. The tension in her chest felt like a dam straining to hold back a flood. She didn't hear the knock at first. "Olivia," a voice called softly through the door. "Come in," she said, her tone sharper than intended. The door opened and Alexander Ross stepped inside, closing it gently behind him. He looked at her not as a judge, but as a woman he'd known for years. "It's him, isn't it?" Her lips trembled. "Alex, it's him, the Marine who saved Jack, the man I've been trying to find for 2 decades. Ross walked closer, his expression shifting from curiosity to quiet understanding. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Olivia whispered. She motioned toward the photograph lying on her desk, the one of her and Jack smiling proudly on the day he'd earned his commission. Jack wrote about him in his letters. "Staff Sergeant Carter, the man who ran into enemy fire to pull my brother out." Ross picked up the photo, studying it with a heavy frown. "And now he's here in your courtroom, facing charges for trying to stay warm on a winter night." Olivia's hands clenched into fists. "How does this happen, Alex? How does a hero like him end up alone, unseen, dragged into court for surviving?" Ross exhaled slowly. "The same way it happens to so many others, PTSD. Red tape, a system that forgets the men it promised to honor." He met her eyes. "We can't let this man lose his dignity again, Olivia." She nodded firmly, her voice steadier now. "No, not again. He carried my brother on his back to safety. I can carry him through this courtroom." Ross placed the photograph back on the desk and straightened his jacket. "Then let's remind them all who Elias Carter really is." As he stepped out of her chambers, Olivia sat for a long moment in silence. Her fingers brushed over the photo once more. The young face of her brother looked back at her, full of hope. And in her heart, she heard Jack's voice like a faint echo. Carter was the best of us, the kind of Marine who'd risk everything for his brothers. When Olivia finally rose to return to the bench, her posture was flawless, but her hands trembled just slightly as she reached for the door. The courtroom stands, honor returned to Elias Carter. The courtroom door creaked open, and Judge Olivia Parker stepped back in, her robe flowing behind her like a banner of quiet authority. The air felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were bracing for what was about to unfold. Her face was calm, almost unreadable, but beneath that judicial mask her heart was pounding like a drum. She adjusted her glasses, scanning the room until her eyes landed on Elias Carter. He sat motionless, his back straightened out of instinct, though his shoulders still sagged under decades of invisible weight. "Mr. Carter," her voice carried across the silent room, softer than before yet heavy with intent. "Your military file lists Fallujah 2004. Is that correct?" Elias hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. And on April 17th, during an operation near the western edge of the city, were you part of a unit ambushed while escorting a convoy?" Elias' cloudy eyes seemed to sharpen, like an old photograph coming into focus. His hands tightened on the table as memories long buried clawed their way back. "Yes, ma'am. We were pinned down by enemy fire." "During that firefight, did you carry a wounded officer, Lieutenant Jack Parker, to safety under heavy gunfire?" The name hung in the air like a sacred prayer. Elias' lips parted, his breath catching. "Parker," he whispered. "Yes. Young lieutenant. Took a round to the leg while trying to pull a medic out of harm's way. Told me to leave him, but I wouldn't. Dragged him behind the Humvee and got him on the bird." A hush fell over the room, deeper than before. It felt as if every soul present was holding its breath. Judge Parker's voice wavered just slightly. "Lieutenant Jack Parker was my brother." The gallery gasped, and even the prosecutor's pen froze mid-note. Elias' eyes widened, his weathered face reflecting shock, disbelief, and something else, an ache he had carried for 20 years. The sound of polished shoes on tile broke the silence. The double doors opened, and 3 United States Marines entered in full dress uniform. Their presence was commanding, their movements precise and deliberate. At their center, a young corporal carried a polished wooden box in his white-gloved hands. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The senior officer, a colonel with silver at his temples, stepped forward. His voice boomed, steady and reverent. "Staff Sergeant Elias Carter, in recognition of extraordinary heroism on April 17th, 2004, by order of the Secretary of the Navy, you are hereby awarded the Navy Cross." The corporal opened the box to reveal the gleaming medal resting on deep blue velvet, the second highest honor a Marine could receive. Elias sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, his hands trembling. "There must be some mistake," he said quietly. "I was just doing my job." "No mistake, Sergeant," the colonel replied firmly. "This recognition is long overdue." From the back of the room, a silver-haired veteran in a Marine League jacket rose to his feet. His voice rang out with the sharpness of memory. "That's him. That's the man who saved us in Fallujah. He pulled 6 of us out that day, bleeding from his own wounds, and never asked for a damn thing in return." Another veteran stood, then another, their faces etched with respect and gratitude. One by one, they raised their hands in a crisp salute. The sound of shuffling feet spread across the room. Civilians, jurors, even the young prosecutor stood silently, some with tears brimming in their eyes. Soon the entire courtroom was on its feet, a wave of reverence washing over the man they had once overlooked. Elias' lips quivered as he struggled to process the scene. His back straightened instinctively, his old Marine bearing breaking through years of weariness. Judge Parker's voice trembled but remained resolute. "In light of these extraordinary developments, all charges against Staff Sergeant Elias Carter are hereby dismissed, permanently." Her gavel came down with a firm, deliberate strike that echoed through the chamber like a drumbeat of justice. As the crowd began to settle, the older veteran called out again, his voice rich with pride. "Attention on deck." The words rolled through the room like thunder. Without hesitation, every Marine in the room snapped to attention, their hands raised in salute once more. And for the first time in decades, Elias Carter no longer felt invisible. A name remembered, when dignity finds its way home. 2 weeks had passed since that unforgettable day in court, and the world outside still moved at its hurried pace. But inside a modest apartment on the second floor of a quiet veterans housing complex, time seemed to flow differently, slower, softer, more forgiving. Elias Carter stood in the center of the small living room, the warm afternoon light filtering through sheer curtains. His calloused hands smoothed the fabric of a freshly laundered shirt, a simple act that felt almost foreign after years of surviving in the cold. On the bare wall in front of him hung a frame larger than any he had ever owned. Inside, the Navy Cross rested on deep blue velvet, flanked by two purple hearts and service medals long thought lost. Alexander Ross's firm had tracked them down, recovered from a dusty storage unit sold off years ago when Elias could no longer pay the fees. The man staring back at those medals in the reflection of the glass wasn't the same frail figure who had shuffled into that courtroom. He stood straighter now, not because the weight of the years had lifted, but because, for the first time in decades, someone had helped him carry it. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Elias opened it slowly, unsure who to expect. Judge Olivia Parker stood there, no longer wearing her robes of authority but a simple wool coat. In her hands she held a small wooden box tied with ribbon. "May I come in, Sergeant Carter?" she asked gently. "Just Elias is fine," he replied, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Then it's just Olivia," she said with a warmth that melted the formality between them. They sat across from each other at a small table. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of a heater in the corner. Olivia set the box between them and opened it. Inside were carefully folded letters, their edges worn but lovingly preserved. "They're from Jack," she said softly. "He wrote us almost every week while he was deployed. This one mentions you." Elias' hands trembled slightly as he lifted the letter. The handwriting was neat and familiar, and for a moment it felt like Jack Parker was still alive, speaking through time. "Mom, Dad, Olivia, don't worry about the news you're hearing. I'm safe, thanks to one of our NCOs. Staff Sergeant Carter did something yesterday I still can't believe. When our convoy got ambushed, he moved through enemy fire like it didn't exist. He refused to leave me behind, even when I ordered him to. Said, 'No Marine gets left behind, not on my watch.'" Elias' voice broke on the last line, and he had to pause. His eyes glistened as he stared at the faded ink. "He mentioned you often," Olivia said, her voice low but steady. "He said you were the kind of Marine he wanted to become. That you showed him what leadership looked like, even in the darkest moments." Elias swallowed hard. "He was a good officer," he murmured. "Still young, but he cared about his men, that's rare." Olivia glanced around the apartment, her gaze resting on the frame of medals. "After Jack died, I went to law school. The Veterans Court program, the housing initiative you're part of, it all started because of the things he wrote home. About how the system forgets its own." Elias lowered his head. "I'm not a hero," he whispered. "I just did what needed to be done." "That's exactly what heroes always say," Olivia replied with a faint smile. There was a pause as the two sat in the stillness of shared grief and unspoken understanding. "There's one more thing you should know," she added gently. "The day Jack died, he was leading a mission to protect civilians from insurgents. He volunteered. In his final letter, he wrote that he wanted to live up to the example you set." The words hit Elias harder than any battlefield wound. For 20 years, he had carried the heavy doubt that maybe saving Jack had only delayed the inevitable. That maybe his sacrifice hadn't mattered. "He didn't die because of you," Olivia said, reading the conflict on his face. "He lived, and the way he lived was because of you." Elias looked at her, the weight in his eyes finally softening. "For years, sleeping on sidewalks, I kept thinking no one remembered, that none of it mattered anymore." Olivia reached across the table, her hand resting over his. "It did matter," she said quietly, "to Jack, to every Marine you saved. And to me." Elias inhaled deeply, his chest rising with a strength he thought he'd lost long ago. He stood and walked slowly to the window. Outside, snowflakes drifted from the gray sky, coating the world in a clean, quiet white. The kind of snow that made even the harshest streets look soft. "Someone remembered my name," he said softly. After all this time, someone remembered. And in that moment, a part of him began to heal. Not just the soldier who had endured war, but the man who had endured being forgotten. As the snow continued to fall, he whispered words that felt truer than any he'd ever spoken. "No Marine gets left behind, not even me." Sometimes the greatest heroes are not the ones on magazine covers or in history books. They are the quiet souls who carried the weight of others, who gave everything and asked for nothing, and yet we're left to fade into the background of a world too busy to notice. Elias Carter's story reminds us all of something powerful. That dignity doesn't come from medals or headlines, but from the simple act of being seen, remembered, and loved. How many other names are still waiting to be spoken aloud? How many lives like his deserve a second chance? If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Black Unbreakable, and share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear how Elias' journey speaks to you. And don't stop here, because in the videos ahead, we'll bring you more untold stories of African descendants in today's world. Stories of pain and injustice, yes, but also of breathtaking resilience, unexpected triumphs, and the unstoppable spirit that inspires us all to rise higher. So stay with us. The next chapter might just change how you see the world and yourself.